Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live stream. I am sorry we're starting a little bit late, but we will be here for the full time and it will be available to watch afterwards as well. So, my name is Catherine Hayhoe. I am a climate scientist and chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and we are speaking here just right at the end of COP16. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, there are actually three different COPs. We often talk about the climate COP, and that one is coming up next month. But the one that is happening right now in Cali, Colombia is the biodiversity COP. So the theme of that COP speaks to our discussion today, which is peace with nature. And today we are going to be talking about biodiversity net gain and about the connection between biodiversity, well-being, and climate resiliency. So, I am a climate scientist, but I am a huge fan of nature because nature has solutions for us that offer multiple wins for our health, for our air, our water, our food, for the safety of the places we live, and for the incredible biodiversity that this planet supports. So today we're going to be talking to two experts on what's called BNG. That stands for biodiversity net gain. And what it does is it ensures that our habitat and our ecosystems are left in a measurably better state than they were before development by humans occurred. Now, this concept was actually introduced in the UK by the Environment Act in 2021, which is 3 years ago, but it became mandatory this February. And it requires explicitly, this rule in the UK requires most development to deliver at least a 10% increase in the net biodiversity value of the property. So, in other words, development is not just going to be nature neutral, it will be legally required to be nature positive. And this is a huge shift in development, enormous for all different aspects of both the natural environment and our own as well. So joining me here, we have two experts. First of all, we have Laura Salem, who is a GIS and data visualization expert with Oxygen Conservation. Oxygen Conservation is a nonprofit in the UK that acquires and restores land to deliver all kinds of natural capital solutions and services that basically allow nature to pay to protect and improve itself. Welcome, Laura. And then we also have Tash Senior, who is a GIS consultant with Esri UK. And of course, Esri is hosting this webinar. And Esri is a company that specializes in geographic information system software. That's what GIS stands for, to map and look at information and data by location. Welcome, Tash, as well. So, everybody, don't forget you can put your questions in the chat. I know people are already welcoming others and sharing where they're joining from today. You can put your questions in the chat, and at the end, we will take a few of your questions today. So, first of all, actually, let me ask you, Laura, where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining from Kendal in Cumbria in the northwest of England.
Excellent. So you're based in the UK, and the UK really is, at least in my impression from the other side of the Atlantic, a leader in working with nature. Whenever I read headlines about rewilding or nature positive solutions and now biodiversity net gain, I feel like the examples people are using are always from the UK. So, what do all of these different efforts have in common, and what are you and your organization specifically working on in this area?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different terminology out there at the moment: biodiversity net gain, rewilding, nature restoration. And I think there are subtle differences between these things and their approach, but that ultimately the goal of all of them is to help nature and improve biodiversity in a location. At Oxygen Conservation, our mission is to scale conservation in the UK. We have 10 estates covering almost 30,000 acres of land, and we're focusing on large landscape level transformation, which will deliver biodiversity impact over long time scales. That's our lovely estate in North Devon called Mornicott, where we're in the middle of an ambitious biodiversity led project. So in the past, the landscape there has been heavily farmed, and it was also run as a commercial grouse shoot. So you can see from the photo that there are lots of different habitats already on the estate. That there's grassland, there's woodland, but there's kind of hard boundaries between those habitats, and a lot of the condition of them needed improvement as well. So our project there is going to involve adding new areas of habitat, wetland, patches of scrub, lowland meadows to the existing landscape, and also taking the grazing pressure off the landscape by reducing the number of animals being farmed there. So it's going to massively improve the condition of the existing habitats and allow a more diverse array of plant species to grow. So we're kind of hoping for this like more messier, more exciting landscape that's going to provide a greater variety of habitat and plant species.
I love that. If I can use messier and more exciting in my life more, I think I will. Bringing in Tash now. Tash, you are also a GIS expert. How is Esri helping to support increasing BNG in the UK and support resiliency for both climate and nature?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me here, Catherine. It's great to be here as a representative as Esri. And something that not many people know is that Esri actually stands for Environmental Systems Research Institute. So creating a sustainable future is really at the heart of what we do. And geography is a mechanism for this. And given that today's panel is all about, GIS and biodiversity, firstly, what is GIS? So for those of you on the call here, it's about layering all these disparate data together on top of each other to help make quicker and more efficient decisions. And that's essentially what we're doing with regulations like biodiversity net gain. We need to really understand what habitat we have on our sites, where that is. If we're doing developments, how's that impacting the habitat, and where we can really start to either improve or add biodiversity on the rest of our site. And within this concept, if we can't do it on our site, then looking at off-site solutions, which is where oxygen conservation come in. So when we think about Esri, we're really in a unique position where we can start to collaborate cross-sector across the whole of this life cycle of what we call a biodiversity net gain. And we're in this unique position where we've got customers across the whole of this life cycle. That could be those who are setting the regulation within the UK, like DEFRA, so our Department for Food and Rural Affairs. It could be big infrastructure organizations, so those who are actually planning and designing and building the infrastructure, and they need to rely on their ecologists and environmental consultancies to do this work. It could be the likes of big landowners like Oxygen Conservation. And then it can also be actually that end piece of submitting these planning applications where these, biodiversity regulations come into play to local authorities. So yeah, it's really brilliant to be seeing that within Esri and seeing how all of our customers are starting to react to this regulation.
So just to be totally clear, when somebody is building something, for example, obviously, if you're building a building, you are taking away from biodiversity. But if you can't not only restore but increase biodiversity on your site, the legislation allows for you to do so on a different site. Is that correct?
Essentially, yes. So if you can't add on-site, which is the recommendation, there's a hierarchy. So afterwards, then they would advise you to add off-site. So organizations like Oxygen Conservation allow you to do that and buy those off-site credits. And if that's then not possible, then you can start to go and buy units as well on the registry.
Okay, that makes sense. And so this is all within the UK, is that right?
This is all within the UK, yeah.
Yes. Excellent. All right. So then the next obvious question then is how do you plan for biodiversity net gain and how do people measure the impact? Because once something is legislated and once you have to, make sure that you're increasing by at least 10%, how is that actually measured and how is it visualized and what does GIS have to do with this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've got customers across the whole of that life cycle. So we've really heard about the challenges relating to this regulation. And, there can be challenges when new regulation comes into play. So something that we've seen is customers have a challenge around capturing their habitat baselines. And what that means is actually understanding what species are on their site. Is it neutral grassland? Is it woodland? And, this is something that I've seen myself when I was doing field work out in the ocean. I was capturing species data and being able to capture that. There was always a reliance on paper forms. And this is something that we're seeing with these sorts of regulations with ecologists going out and relying on paper forms. And it's fair to say with this regulation, it's very rich in terms of the data that you need to capture within the BNG metric. And so using something like GIS allows us to really simplify this. And what you can see here on the screen is that we can start to visualize this with field applications. So Temple Group is a brilliant example of this. They have used our Suite for ArcGIS web editing application, and they have baked in topology rules into this so that when they're actually capturing habitats out in the field, they can see what they're capturing. They're able to understand the units that feed into that regulation, and this starts to mitigate challenges like unaccounted slithers of habitats across their site. So we can see that it's been really powerful. And some other ways that we can do this is that we've seen challenges around organizations working in silos. So that could be internally within their teams or externally with stakeholders. So a nice example of this is you may have landscape designers who are being part of that design. You may have your ecologists out in the field, and you may have your GIS team. And so they're all working in those siloed teams, but we really need to work together to understand, are we meeting that 10% gain? And if not, how does that play into our design iterations or our infrastructure? And a really brilliant example of this is Anglian Water, who have created their own end-to-end workflow. So they've been able to create an internal BNG tool. And this is really important because they look after 7,000 hectares of land, so a huge amount. And with this tool, they can then push this out into the field and serve this to their internal staff so that they can use it to work offline and capture their habitats. They can then push it into their internal systems like Azure, and then start to visualize this in Power BI reports or in dashboards or experience builders. So it's really helping to disseminate this and share it with these wider teams.
Mm-hmm. As well as, of course, sharing examples and case studies and best practices and things that people can learn from. So, Laura, let's ask you more about what you're doing with oxygen conservation. So, how is oxygen conservation measuring this impact? Like you described the beautiful mess that you're creating. How do you measure this impact, and how are you using GIS to support the work you do?
Yeah, so we start all of our projects by doing a full environmental baseline of the estate. So we want to know what we have already before we kind of
Mhm.
start making any changes. So we do habitat surveys of all the estates on the left there. That's our habitat baseline at Monacot. But as part of that survey, it looks at the types of habitat and their condition. And then this makes up the basis of the number of biodiversity units, which is held within a landscape as part of the BNG scheme. So you can see
Mm.
on the right there that we're visualizing the landscape by the number of units found per hectare. So that's kind of a way of visualizing where is high in biodiversity and maybe needs protecting or expanding, or somewhere where we can connect habitats together, and then where is areas where are a bit weaker and we can start to strategize and find ways which we're going to improve the landscape.
Mhm.
So yeah, bringing all of that data into ArcGIS, it's like Tash was saying, it's a great moment to get the whole team together to look at it on a map. I think there's something about visualizing that information on a map and being like, let's put something here, let's create woodland here, let's add scrub, let's put in wetlands in these low-lying areas. It's a really nice moment to get together and be like, how can we make big interesting changes on that landscape?
I love that. Well, so this is really, really the trillion-dollar question. I mean, nature, I think, is valued at a potentially $7 trillion market worldwide. So the big question is, these regulations are currently specific to the UK. So, but they're using practices and they're using tools that could be applied anywhere, right? I mean, obviously, from one ecosystem to the another, the exact things you would do for the ecosystem would differ. But this approach of looking at net gain in nature and the approach of using GIS as a tool to do so, you can implement it pretty much anywhere, right? So, how would this benefit global efforts for climate and for nature? And what advice would you give to organizations who are looking to incorporate BNG into their work, whether they're in the UK or not?
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Mm,
Obviously, biodiversity net gain is specific to the UK, but I think that a lot of organizations around the world are seeing the importance of setting ESG strategies within their business, in particular, net zero targets. They're becoming an increasingly desirable thing for companies to work towards. But wouldn't it be amazing if the same focus and drive was applied to biodiversity as well? Every company could have a net zero target for carbon and then a net positive target for biodiversity. Um, Even in the absence of a specific net positive biodiversity target, I still think it's important for companies to consider their own biodiversity impact. So any carbon offsetting they do as part of their net zero targets, it would be amazing if they worked with organizations who provide high quality carbon credits, which also deliver real gain to biodiversity. If you're looking at something like a woodland credit, that the company is providing them with native biodiverse woodlands which are in keeping with the landscape and are going to make a real difference to both carbon and net zero, but also to biodiversity as well.
Absolutely. I love that big paradigm shift that you're implying, which is that when we think about what we're doing, so much of what we've been doing is very extractive. It's very destructive. If we look at biodiversity loss, unsustainable use of natural resources and exploitation is the number one driver of biodiversity loss. And then climate change, of course, adds an extra layer, accelerating this process. And
Absolutely.
people often say, well, we can't afford to choose between the planet or people or the economy or the environment. And of course, the answer to that is, as there's an old cartoon says, there's no profit on a dead planet. And I would even go farther and I would say, nature doesn't need us, we need it. So we are the
Definitely.
ones who depend on nature for literally everything, right? Like the oxygen we breathe, the water we drink, the food we
Food
eat,
we
all the resources we use. And if we humans disappeared off the face of the earth, nature would be fine. But if nature disappeared off the face of the earth, we would be gone. That would be the end of us. So everything you're talking about is not a choice between people or the planet, the environment or the economy. It is a choice for people and for the economy and for the environment and for the planet together. And you're really flipping the paradigm so we can actually look at all of those things as gains together rather than priorities that are in conflict. And that's why I love this concept so much. So let me ask you, Tash, then Esri is a global company. It is actually based in the United States, but the software that you have is used all around the world. So you're working in the UK, but obviously these practices can be applied elsewhere. So what advice would you give to organizations who are looking to take a biodiversity net gain approach to their work?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what you were saying. We have this reliance on nature, and having these sorts of regulations really creates those actions. So with COP16, the timing is really important. What I would say is that it's wonderful that we've got the global biodiversity framework, but a lot more must be done to strengthen policies and ones that actually incentivize nature positive actions like BNG to hold organizations accountable. um, but it's also important that organizations hold themselves accountable. This regulation isn't in, every country in the world. So we really can't wait. Um, and we really need to improve our thinking around this. So, what I would say, speaking to other organizations, is that we can really start to learn and collaborate from others around us. What you can see here is a brilliant panel of our customers discussing some of the challenges and solutions around biodiversity net gain. And we can really learn from them. I mean, there's some brilliant panels that I've been to. And I think what this really, one of the key things is that there's a lot of like minded people who are advocates around striving for nature positive action. So, within your organization, start a focus group. That's something that we've done within Esri UK that's been really powerful to drive change. And one of the second things that I would say is, find a good intuitive tool like GIS. This can be part of the answer. So finding it early and playing around with some of the workflows that it can do can really be powerful. I mean, thinking back to Anglian Water, they were looking at biodiversity units before the regulation came out, and they've seen so much more than 10% net gain. So yeah, there's some really brilliant stuff that you can do. But what I really want you, I guess, to take away is that regulations like biodiversity net gain have really started the conversation with us in the UK. And it's shown us that geography and technology are really powerful in, being part of being the solution for the climate crisis. So um, biodiversity net gain is only a small part of the picture. It's focusing on land use and development. So we really need to think big around natural capital, and really just start discussing this like we are today.
Exactly. So in your mind, how and I want to ask both of you this, how does nature and climate combine? Because so often people think of, I work on climate. Well, I work on nature. Well, I work on biodiversity, which they might think of as separate from nature. And then we haven't even talked about pollution, but obviously pollution is not only one of the main factors contributing to the biodiversity crisis, it's a main factor contributing to a health crisis. More people die every year from breathing in the particulates produced by burning fossil fuels than have died from COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. But we know, of course, that nature is a huge solution to things like pollution of air, water, and soil, as well as solutions to climate resilience, climate mitigation, and more. So, how do you see all these going together? And what would you say to people who still view these as separate buckets? Let me ask you first, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely interlinked, aren't they? So there's, by building up nature, you're also kind of getting ahead on the carbon side of things. Carbon's stored in the soil, it's stored in trees, in woodland. It's like very much an interlinked process where by improving biodiversity is also going to improve carbon storage and things like that as well. I think it's also, it's a case of resilience to climate change as well. The climate is changing, and improving biodiversity is going to make a massive difference to ecosystems' ability to adapt. Their ability to adapt to extreme events, heat waves, flooding, things like that are all going to be massively improved by biodiversity. So I think it's not something that we can ignore and just say, we're just going to look at one thing, we're just going to look at carbon, we're just going to try and improve that. I think, yeah, it's better to think of these things as a kind of holistic one thing together. It's all nature, um, yeah.
Yeah, the way it's like the way I think of sustainability is simply learning to live well on a round planet. Because for so long we have lived as if our planet were infinite and flat. Like there's always more resources over here to get. There's
Mm.
always somewhere to put our pollution and waste that we don't want. And that's not true. Our planet is round. And so what is sustainability other than learning how to live on a round planet? And isn't that integral to the future of humans and human society on this planet? So Tash, I really like the way that you put it too about nature. How would you just tell people very briefly, how would you suggest people think about this whole
Yeah.
nature, climate, biodiversity mix?
Yeah, and it's really important because, yeah, Lara touched on it. It's about this ecological connectivity. When you are taking, a certain section of habitat away, you're then impacting and having a real kind of negative feedback on the whole ecosystem. And so everything's interlinked. We've got our customers who they want to understand about the umbrella of natural capital. They need to understand around air pollution, carbon sequestration, nutrient neutrality. They all interlink together, and that's something that we need to bear in mind when these regulations come out. They're great for creating action, but we need to think about this holistically. So yeah, a really important point.
Yes. Well, we have a couple of questions from the audience, and if you have a question that you didn't put in there yet, it's not too late. We will probably have time to pick one or two more. The first question we had very briefly is the question of nature as infrastructure, and the idea that we integrate nature as a foundational asset. What can businesses and organizations do to put the idea of nature as infrastructure into action? Well, let me say that first of all, I live in the state in the United States that is the most vulnerable to climate impacts. So the state of Texas has more weather and climate disasters than any other state. And of course, we know that one of the biggest ways climate change is affecting us in the places we live is by supersizing these weather disasters, as we had just saw in Valencia, Spain, just the other day. And of course, a few weeks ago, we saw two devastating hurricanes in the United States. In my home country of Canada, we had our wildfire season last year that was the largest ever on record. These floods and heat waves and droughts and storms are just getting stronger and stronger. And we know that our infrastructure that we have today, our homes, our buildings, our roads, all of our infrastructure, including our electrical grids, our water systems, they were all built for a planet that doesn't exist. They were built for climate conditions of the past. And so adaptation is happening, but it is not happening fast enough anywhere. And that puts us all at risk. But the good news is that nature has the huge potential to help us adapt. So, for example, in large urban cities, low income neighborhoods can be up to 7 or 8 degrees Celsius hotter because of lack of green space. But when we green those areas, not only does it provide protection during heat waves, it also provides protection from flood because there's somewhere for the water to go. The vegetation filters the air and reduces air pollution, as well as improving people's physical and mental health. In fact, at the Nature Conservancy, we just finished, I think, the first clinical trial of nature as a solution for health, where medical researchers, measured biomarkers of inflammation in the human body in a neighborhood that had been greened versus a neighborhood that had not been greened. And that's what we talk about with green infrastructure. And there was a significant reduction in inflammation, which leads to a host of issues, from cardiac issues, heart issues, to lung issues, to even mental health issues. We know along coastlines, mangroves along coastlines and coastal wetlands protect against storm surge. So there's all of these win-win-wins that you can literally put numbers on, right? I mean, isn't that part of what you do, Laura, at Oxygen Conservancy, is literally put numbers on what nature can do for us?
Absolutely. Nature has an inherent value. I think
Mhm.
people realizing that is what is really important for people to realize that. And as you said, like, nature's an incredible engineer. We have a lot of issues with flooding in the UK, and it's something that's getting forecast to get increasingly worse. And people are very much noticing it at the moment. On a lot of our estates, we're planning river restoration works. We like to use the term rewiggling for the rivers,
Oh,
you know,
like
turning
that.
them from straight lines where the water just flows very rapidly through and can potentially go on and flood downstream, to having curves, having trees which can soak up some of the water, having areas where the water moves fast, areas where the water moves more slowly, wetland areas, and all of those things are amazing for nature, but also amazing for us if they can stop any kind of flooding or any damage to people's homes.
I love that phrase, rewiggling. So I'm going to add that too. So Tash, let me ask you a question that somebody had in the audience. We know, and I think Laura, you referred to this earlier, there is a hierarchy of actions to take, right? So often when people think about nature-based solutions, they automatically jump to the idea of planting trees, which is not protecting, not restoring, but regenerating nature. But how does this approach shift when we're thinking not lower in the hierarchy, but we're thinking higher in the hierarchy about protecting biodiverse places? So not just regenerating, not even just restoring, but protecting them. How does everything we've discussed shift when we think about protecting what we have?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, within the UK, we've got special areas of conservation, and they're really important to be aware of as well when we're thinking about big infrastructure projects. For example, thinking about how far we're away we are from conserving this really biodiverse region. So something like site selection is really important when we're thinking about this. Using geospatial as a mechanism to understand actually where's where's best in the kind of bigger picture of things to actually build a new infrastructure project. Maybe it's something that isn't within a regulation, but you're actually seeing that impact of how far away you are from those places to actually protect biodiversity. And I think it comes down to each individual in our organizations to have the motive to really start to mitigate climate change by taking that upon ourselves.
Well, and location comes into a question that someone posted here for Laura, which is a very specific question, but it's talking about bringing in the idea of waterways or ocean borders. And what if you've got things like wind turbines or, oil platforms at sea? Are there any difficulties in this approach of biodiversity net gain handling water habitat?
Specifically around wind and things like that.
Yeah, obstacles that could be nature neutral or nature negative within the area that you're trying to restore the biodiversity net gain. And I'm thinking, I mean, they didn't say specifically, but obviously in water, you even mentioned too how pollutants travel in water. So water can be a little more challenging than working with terrestrial restoration. What are some nuances there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can be more complicated. There can be issues with agricultural runoff. There's particularly a lot of issues in the UK around sewer overflows and things like that. And I think once they get into the landscape, it's very difficult to get rid of things which are kind of in the water. We're making a real effort on our estates to monitor the water quality. So we have water quality monitors which are in the rivers all the time, and we get live updates from those about loads of different interesting metrics: temperature, pH, turbidity, and all sorts of stuff like that. And by keeping track of those things and then also keeping track of what's happening on the landscape, we can start to be like, what impact is certain things having, moving animals around, agricultural animals, for example. If an estate next door is using fertilizers or things like that, what actual impact is that having? And I think starting by just measuring that and understanding that is then really going to help you be like, how can we improve this, or how can we make it better in the future? So yeah, measuring and monitoring, I think, is hugely important.
It is, and something like that this concept could even lead to other things like water net gain. So one of the projects that the Nature Conservancy is doing in Australia, we're not using water net gain as the title, but it's the same idea. It's that if there's development over here that is affecting a watershed, then that company is restoring the same amount of a watershed over here, which relates to habitat and biodiversity, but also water. So I think that we're coming at it from different angles, but the real goal is like I think you said, Tash, sort of a holistic nature positive perspective where we're looking at species, at biodiversity, at habitat, at water, at carbon, at all of the resources that support life on Earth that we need to truly have a sustainable life on this planet. So a couple of small questions, two small questions for each of you. People are wondering about how do you are the indices open source for like hedgerow networks? And then somebody else asked about citizen science. So there's obviously a lot of information on citizen science of monitoring specific species, for example, or techniques like hedgerow networks. How does that feed into the maps and the spatial data that you use, and then the decisions that you make? Who wants to take that one first?
I'll jump in
Okay.
there. Yeah, it's a brilliant question. One of the starting points is being able to understand what do we actually have, and do we already know before actually going out there. So there's some brilliant open source data sets within our UK government. So I'm sure there are globally. One thing that we've seen customers actually do is some incredible machine learning as well on some imagery to actually extract, for example, hedgerows or waterways or different assets, which can be really powerful in that kind of process. Um, but it was interesting around the citizen science because that goes into it and actually collecting data. We are working with the Department for Education on a big nature parks scheme, which is actually involving lots of children and getting them in touch with nature. So they're going out into the field, they're capturing data, and it's creating that emotional connection, which I think is really important as we go through these
Super important.
generations. And something I would love to see that globally. And there's data sets like iNaturalist as well, which you can go and use that already. And there's some brilliant species photos in there. So yeah, definitely have a look. So yeah, there's lots that you can do as an organization, but there are lots that are open source, and there are quite a lot that are citizen science as well. So
That's exactly what I was going to mention. So iNaturalist is like Pokemon for nature.
yes,
And so it almost it digitizes and almost even gamifies, and in fact it can be gamified, nature for kids, and it teaches kids how to look at nature. So they don't just think they're just looking at like green stuff or grass or dirt, but they're looking at soil that's full of organisms. They're looking at millions of different species of all different sizes and shapes and that have different functions within the ecosystem. Technology is a tool, and we can use technology to keep kids inside, isolated from nature, or we can actually use technology to get them outside and to get them engaged with nature. And so I love this perspective that technology brings to it. Laura, did you have anything to add to that?
I was just going to say that that's a great point that Tash made about engaging people and getting people excited about nature and excited about protecting nature. I also think citizen science and things like that have been a massive asset for us. We acquire an estate and we don't necessarily know a lot about the history. Sometimes we get some really interesting information, particularly people who are very interested in things like bird watching, and they've recorded for years sometimes the species that they've seen on the estates. And we can do our baseline, a year ago, 2 years ago, but having that information about what birds they saw 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that's hugely valuable to us to be able to be like, this bird should be in the landscape. It used to be here, and how can we get it back here if it's not here anymore?
Well, thank you both, Laura and Tasha, for joining us for this. Thank you, everyone, for listening in, whether you listened in live or whether you listened in afterwards. And I just want to end with one comment that someone made in the chat that I love. And they said, "Isn't it ironic that we see these concepts as being revolutionary in Western view, whereas in most indigenous languages, nature is not even a word because it is not seen as a separate entity? We often speak of nature as if we are separate from it. We are not. We are part of nature. And in fact, we are some of the most vulnerable and dependent parts of nature on the rest of these ecosystems. So I hope you learned something interesting about biodiversity net gain this week and how it is interconnected with every aspect of what we do. And as you know, the number one thing that we can do about this is start to have conversations about why this matters and about how each of us can make a difference by using our voice wherever we live, wherever we work, to encourage people to consider nature positive solutions for the benefit of people and the planet, the environment, and the economy, with the end goal of creating a better future for us all. Thank you.